This is the new TC Pride Podcast, episode 124. On location with Zaylore Stout, author of Our Gay History in 50 States. TC Pride Podcast, we are on location in Minneapolis with Mr. Zaylore Stout of Zaylore Stout & Associates. Z, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Why are we here today?
Well, we're going to be talking about my LGBT history book coming out, so titled Our Gay History in 50 States, out just in time for the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots.
That is awesome. So before we do that, though, so you've been on the podcast, I don't know, I lost count of how many times. If we gave away free T-shirts for appearances, you definitely have one by now. We're working on that, though. Don't worry. So most people probably are familiar with you, know who you are by now. But for folks that aren't, and maybe people that have just heard the elevator pitch, what can you tell people about Zaylore Stout?
Well, I'm an employment law attorney. I have my own law firm, Zaylore Stout & Associates. We focus on areas including discrimination, sexual harassment, wrongful termination, and wage and hour. We represent both employers and employees, and we're about, upholding the law.
Yeah, and so you spoke, so congratulations, you actually just joined the board of Quorum this year. You spoke at the National Coming Out Day event a couple of years ago, and you gave a little bit more of your background, and you talked kind of about what it was like growing up for you, growing up where you did, and how you eventually got to Minnesota. For people that weren't there, actually the video of that is on the Quorum Facebook page right now. There you go. Shameless plug. But for people that haven't seen that video, maybe you can tell folks a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it was just some background in regards to me growing up as an only child in Orange County, California. Not the most diverse place in the world. And so, I'm a person of color. So there's that, and dealing with the LGBT issue. And, it was just interesting. And then, the focus, I think, in regards to my speech at National Coming Out Day was the fact that we as members of the LGBTQI plus community need to support each other. And there's a lot of infighting in regards to, the old guard versus the new guard and terms, whether we should use the term queer or gay to represent the entire community. And, whether it's harder for folks to come out as bisexual and transgender to their gay friends, as opposed to coming out or straight as gay or lesbian to your straight friends. So it's broaching that important discussion and conversation about how we still need to come together as a community before we can expect, the broader community to accept us as a whole.
Yeah, we've talked to several people in the podcast who brought up the concept of there's erasure even between some of the letters and so yeah, there definitely are a lot of issues that definitely need addressing, and it's great that people like you are out there working hard to address those issues. One thing I wanted to ask you, so you're an employment discrimination lawyer. So knowing what I do about your background, kind of what you shared about your background, did maybe some of the experiences that you've had sort of along the way throughout your life maybe factor into your decision to fight for justice, I guess, the way that you do?
Well, yeah, actually, there's a specific moment that I can point to. I was a victim of a hate crime while I was in high school. It was during the Rodney King trial. So it was a really racially charged time in Ventura County where the Rodney King trial was taking place. I was thrust in the limelight as a 16, 17-year-old, the NAACP was involved, and I was like, well, what do you want to do? What do you want to have happen? And I was like, well, I want there to be, education and community around this issue. And so I've been involved in this fight since way back when.
Since the 90s. Right?
Yeah, the 90s, right? So it's just led to me working in employment law and loving that and deciding that that's going to be my area to focus on.
And what do you love most about working in that area of the law, I guess? I mean, other than, making a difference the way you do?
Well, it's a lot of times it's standing up for people that are the most disenfranchised within our community. And so whether that be the LGBT community, whether that be the disabled community, whether that be immigrants, I mean, there's lots of different areas where there's disparities and very clear disparities. And so whether I'm working on the employer or the plaintiff side, there's always more work to be done in regards to either holding employers accountable or providing employers with information and insight so they can make the appropriate decisions based on the law. And a lot of that means you you can't do what you want to do because there's laws that protect employees in regards to those areas, and sometimes standing up for employees who've had their rights violated. So I've represented my share of LGBT employees who, were fired because the employer found out that they were HIV positive, or that they were being treated differently in the workplace once the employer found out that they were transgender. So there's still a lot of work to happen in corporate America in regards to this type of work.
Yeah, and so Quorum does a lot. So as an organization, on a very basic level, what we do is we work to ensure that people can bring their whole selves to work and that the workplace is a safe place for people to be. And you actually gave a presentation at a recent Quorum event around sort of like workplace sexual harassment and everything, right? And you actually gave some really good advice. I was kind of in and out sort of the session. I was, taking photos and everything. But you said like if you have, and it can be like a pretty intimidating process if you feel like you've been victimized or harassed. You actually gave some really good advice. You're like, sort of the first thing you need to do is like think about the person, like if your check was wrong, right? Like who would you go to? And that's probably like a good place to start.
Yeah, a lot of times I end up doing a lot of proactive work with employers. So that's doing investigations in regards to issues. And so I end up interviewing a lot of people. Actually, I was just doing a workplace investigation today. And you have, people that are like, well, I didn't know who I should have complained to. And so one of the questions I asked is, well, who would you go and talk to if your check was wrong? And they immediately know who it is that they should go and talk to. And that tends to be the person that's in human resources. And that's in the title, human resources. They're there to help people in regards to these exact issues. So that's my tip for employees if they ever are unclear in regards to who it is that they should go and speak to within their organization, especially if the issue that they're having is with their direct supervisor. Generally, there's a human resource person that you can go, and that's their task with specifically addressing these matters.
And so I'm sure if people have questions, they can also reach out to you as well. So we do want to talk about your book. But first, this is only one part of your life. So you're actually involved in a lot of different areas. And one of the areas that you've been closely involved with is this whole situation that's happening in the Anoka-Hennepin School District. I have to admit, like I haven't been following it like that closely. I know there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of there's a lot to know. But there has been some big things happening recently. Maybe you can catch folks up a little bit on what's been going on there.
Yeah. So I was originally involved in regards to getting a gender inclusion policy passed in the city of St. Louis Park, and that ended up being the first suburb in the state of Minnesota to pass such a policy.
No big deal, right?
No big deal at all.
Congrats, by the way.
Minneapolis and St. Paul had theirs on the books, and no other suburb did. And so the focus then is to make sure that we're spreading that well throughout other suburbs. And so Anoka-Hennepin has had a history in regards to racial issues with students and issues in regards to LGBT students. So recently there was a lawsuit that was filed again by a parent of a transgender student in regards to discrimination for her son in school. He was on the swim team. He was allowed to use the men's locker room for a year. And then the school board reversed and decided after a year of no issues and no problems that they weren't going to allow the student to use that locker room and to use a separate segregated locker room, which just reminds me of separate but equal and all that kind of stuff, which we've already gone through in this country. And so the ACLU and Gender Justice are representing the mother and the student in regard to this area. But the Attorney General's office, Keith Ellison, as well as the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, recently joined in on that lawsuit against the school district. So that was a huge movement to be able to bolster the fact that our elected state officials and organizations that are tasked with addressing discrimination are behind the parent and the student here.
Yeah. And why is what's going on in Anoka-Hennepin specifically so important to actually, so like the surrounding communities and even other places in the country, right?
Yeah, because if you ever want to know how diverse your community is, all you have to do is go to the local school, and you'll end up seeing it's way more diverse than the community that we, as adults interact with, especially in the corporate realm. But, these kids are coming out in elementary school, junior high school, and most of the kids don't have issues with this. It's the adults that have problems with this. So it's about creating a safe space for the kids. It's about, making sure that there's policies and procedures on the book for school administration as well as staff in regard to these areas. For example, in St. Louis Park, before we had the policy on the books, it was students that were training staff in regards to LGBT inclusion and all that kind of stuff. And, high school students shouldn't be training their professors and teachers and administration in regard to these areas. It's the responsibility of us as community members and to make sure that these individuals are trained in regard to these areas and providing systems so that there's that they are held accountable if they deviate from that.
And so one key part of that is educating people about the history of any given sort of culture. And that's actually, well, to talk about our next thing here, that's actually what you're working on too. So this book, this project has been in the works for a little while. What can you tell people about this book and kind of how this whole idea got started and kind of where things are at now?
Well, just finishing off finalizing the book, and it'll be off to the publisher for, getting our first proof, and it'll be out in time for Pride. But the book is Our Gay History in 50 States. It's going to highlight significant people, places, and queer facts on a state-by-state basis. The idea of the book came about during one of my many road trips from California back to Minnesota. It was around the time of Proposition 8, which was the proposition in California to pretty much codify in our state constitution that marriage would be only between a man and a woman. And so there had been some fighting back and forth in court battles, and people were able to get married for a certain period of time, and then the courts came in and said no, and so it was unsure if those marriages would be annulled. So it was a really, really tumultuous time during that time. And so one of my road trips back to Minnesota, I was by myself, and I mean, each time I ended up crossing a state line, I just started thinking to myself, well, what relevance does this state have to LGBT history? What relevance does this state have to LGBT history? Then, of course, when I crossed into Wyoming, I thought about Matthew Shepard and everything that happened with him. And so one of the things that I thought was, well, if I wanted to go lay flowers where he was chained up to that fence, where would I do that? And is that information that's readily available? And then I was thinking, well, there should be a road trip guide for LGBT folks. I mean, you think of America, you think of, convertibles and the open road and road trips. And I was like, yeah, there should be a road trip guide for LGBT folks. And it just kind of grew from that to include people, places, and queer facts in regards to each state. So, one of the focuses for me was that, and when this is one of the issues that I was struggling with during that road trip was, shaking my fist at the sky and saying, why do people in red states and red counties hate gays so much? Right. And what ends up happening is that, the LGBTQIA plus community comes from every state, from every county. And what ends up happening is that, there's not laws that protect folks everywhere. And if you don't feel comfortable where you live, then you're going to go somewhere where you feel comfortable, where you're going to be accepted. And so what ends up happening is that people that live in these rural states and rural communities end up going to the metropolitan states and city centers, leaving those, those areas with no LGBT folks for people to really interact with and come to realize that we're just like everybody else. We just want to have a life and have a family and be able to have a career and all of that kind of stuff. So thinking about it from that perspective, and hopefully being able to create some hope for kids that are in those areas that aren't able to pick up and leave, to be able to know that, there have been significant contributions from every single state in our country from LGBT folks from there. And so that was like the main focus for the book, not just to provide those resources for folks that are in the cities, but also mainly in those rural areas.
And so aside from fighting for justice in your day job and as a hobby, right? So you've actually been involved in a lot of social justice work. You're actually currently also on the board of another organization, Reclaim. And I understand some of the people that benefit from those services actually contributed to the book.
Yep. So Reclaim provides mental health services to transgender and gender non-binary youth. I've been on the board for 3 years now. And so one of the important things for the book for me as well was I know, based on my personal experience, how diverse the LGBTQ plus community is. And that diversity isn't always shown in the media or in other books and publications. So I wanted to make sure that this book was going to be inclusive of everybody. So, I made sure that there's LGBT folks that are in there that have disabilities. I made sure that we have representatives from the intersex community and from the asexual community and polyamorous folks. I mean, I wanted to make sure that it was as diverse as possible. And it took a lot of work, extra extra work to go in and make sure that diversity was there and present. And sometimes I would have researchers, doing the preliminary digging, come back with research for a particular state, and I could easily look at it and be like, where are the lesbians? It's like, are there no lesbians in this state? Or it's like, where are the transgender folks? And, even when we're looking at transgender folks, you want to make sure that there's representation in regards to trans men. So there was a lot of intentional effort put into making sure that, anybody that picks up this book will be able to find at least one person in that book that they can identify with. And that's not something that I had when I was younger and growing up.
And let's talk about the title for a second, because we talk a lot about acronyms and sort of different words that are used to sort of describe different parts of the community or the community as a whole. Maybe we can dig a little deeper into the title of the book for a second.
Okay. Yeah, so that was a bit of a struggle in regards to coming up with the name for the book, because you want something that represents everybody, but then is marketable as well. And so there was some difficulty in regard to that. But, I ended up deciding to title the book Our Gay History in 50 States, because everything comes back to Stonewall riots, right? And there was a moment in our country's history, especially in the very beginning with our movement, where people didn't have a problem with it being called the gay rights movement. The gay rights movement included everybody that wasn't straight, right? Wasn't heterosexual. So since this is a history book, and the history goes well before the Stonewall riots. I mean, back to before our country was founded. There's entries that go that far back.
There's stuff in there. Huh?
Yeah, there's stuff that goes that far back. That's why I decided to use that as the term. And there was some struggle in regards to using the term gay or using the term queer. If you use the term queer, you lose a certain demographic and the old guard in regards to the LGBT movement. But then if you use gay, then you have the younger folks that are like, I'm not gay, that doesn't represent me, or I'm intersex, and that that doesn't necessarily represent me. So there's an entry in the beginning of the book that goes over some of these basic issues and tenets that focus on why I'm using the term queer, and that I'm intentionally using the term queer in regard to the book, and that in using our gay history in 50 states, it's not saying just the gay men that are being represented in regard to this book. It's using a term, a phrase that was coined early in the movement that represented all of us at one point in time.
Well, it sounds like a lot of thought went into this. So if anybody out there thinks that maybe there wasn't, it sounds like there was.
No, there was. But there's been very little pushback in regards to it thus far. And, what I would say is, folks should buy the book and give it a chance and take a look, and they'll find some great information in there.
And so there are 50 states and then some, I understand, right? There's Puerto Rico and a couple other ones in there. So we can't talk about all of them, obviously, right? But what are some of the things maybe that you learned about specific states sort of along the way? It sounds like there was probably a lot of research involved in this process.
There was a ton of research that was involved in this process. And the sad part is that, everything couldn't make it in the book. Yeah. There's a lot that's on the cutting room floor. So I'd recommend that folks follow our book's Facebook page and Twitter and all that kind of stuff. Instagram, we even have an Instagram, because, we'll be including entries there that didn't necessarily make it in the book. But there were certain states like Washington State had so much history. It was just kind of amazing. They even had a drag queen that was back in the gold rush days that was very, very well known. And I wish I could have dug up additional information on her, but there just wasn't enough to have a full entry. But that may be an example of something that may show up in the blog or, in some of these social media areas to be able to share with folks, because there's just been so much history.
And I understand you have a couple of entries from the actual book that you wanted to share with us today, including maybe one sneak peek yet to be released entry.
Yes, I'll have a special entry for you that hasn't been released yet.
We love the scoops. We always love the exclusive scoops. So fire away.
Well, I'll give you some that you may already have heard already, especially if you follow us on Facebook or any of the social media platforms. So, the trend, the transgender issue is something that's really in the news today, and a lot of people think, well, this is a new phenomenon. This is a phase for people, and I assure you, it's nothing new, right? Because we have those that are part of the Two Spirit community, which are part of the Native American community, and they've been revered members of their communities from well before, our country was founded.
Yeah, and actually, before we go too deep into that, so I think that might be one of the letters of the acronym, for lack of a better, that maybe people don't know much about. What did you learn about that specific part of the community throughout this process?
Wow. I definitely would not ever claim to be the expert in regards to it, but there's way more genders than anybody could ever imagine. I think, different tribes have different names for those that are Two Spirit. They don't go by the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, labels that Americans and Europeans subscribe in regards to, those that are not heterosexual is how I would phrase it. But each tribe has their own name and reference in regards to it, and there's different genders that come along with the different tribes. So I think there's at least one tribe or multiple tribes where there's maybe even 100 different genders. And so there's a lot to dig into in regards to that. But the interesting thing that I also learned in regards to the Two Spirit community is that, historically they've been revered within their communities and their cultures. But once the Americans came with their European perspectives and that ended up resulting in some of the tribes and pushing back in regard to these people who have always been revered within their communities. And so this has been a struggle for certain nations in regards to, how to rectify these things.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's definitely a little bit more about this in the book, right? So
yes, there's some more about it in the book. It's definitely not a book that's focused on the Two Spirit community. There's great resources that we've referenced in our book for that. So we can always point folks in the direction for additional information from authors that are Two Spirit that have written about this specifically.
So speaking of which, that's kind of a good point to make, is that this book in a lot of ways can be seen as really like a good, like, kind of starting off point for people to just sort of get sort of the primer on maybe some different parts of the country or different communities, and like really kind of just the jumping off point to learn more.
Yeah, this is not intended to be comprehensive. There's in no way comprehensive. And so, I was speaking to a friend in regards to the book, and he's like, yeah, but I'm really not a reader and all that kind of stuff, but I'm excited about your book. And I was like, this is great because, the book has, really easy to digest chunks of information. It's not really intended for somebody to sit down and read it from cover to cover, though we encourage people to do that. But with the state-by-state format, we expect for folks to jump to their home state and see what's there in regard to their home state. And they may not necessarily see somebody from their home state and wonder why they're not there. Well, the interesting thing with that is part of the thing that we had to come up with is how do you end up spreading out everybody across the country so that everybody from the LGBT community isn't chunked on the coast, right? Not everybody's in California or New York or Florida, right? And so what we ended up doing was crediting people's contributions back to the state that they were born. So nobody has any, control over where they were born. And clearly LGBT folks were born all over the place. And so that's been the kind of amazing part, because you'll see like an Ellen DeGeneres, and you wouldn't think Louisiana, but that's where she's from, right? So was Don Lemon. And so, there's folks that are in different states that you wouldn't expect for them to be. Andy Warhol is not in New York, but I'll let you go over and track down and find where he is.
Sounds good. Sounds like a fair way to do it. So anyway, back to the specific entries here.
Yeah. So Alan L. Hart was born in Kansas and is actually the first documented transgender male transition in the United States. And that happened in 1917. Either 1917 or 1918 at the University of Oregon Medical School. So, way back then, we had...
I'm not very good at math, but that's like a long time ago, right? We're talking...
It's a while ago. It's been a while ago. We're almost, I think we actually just passed 100 years in regards.
100 years. Right?
100 years since the first transgender surgery from female to male. So,
So this fad, quote unquote, is nothing new, is what you're...
It's been quite the long fad, if that's exactly what it is, but that's not the case at all. Another important point that I want to make sure I highlight is we're very intentional in regards to making sure that Puerto Rico was included in this book. And so one of the things that we highlight in the book, and this is one of our places that we highlight, is the fact that the first LGBT monument in our country was actually in Puerto Rico. And it's in honor of those that died at the Pulse nightclub shooting. And so what a lot of people don't necessarily know is that of the 49 victims that died at Pulse nightclub, 23 were Puerto Rican. And so half of the people that were killed on that tragic day were from Puerto Rico. And so the island has, you know, devastated on a different level than the rest of us have. I mean, I remember being devastated. I'm getting chills just thinking of the Pulse nightclub shooting. But, you know, and so they have a beautiful monument for LGBT folks and those that died at Pulse nightclub in Puerto Rico. So I'm excited one day to be able to go and see the monument there.
Yeah. And this was the entry that hasn't been shared anywhere else yet, right?
Yep, that's the entry that hasn't been shared anywhere else. But the other one that I like to be able to share as well is, you know, when you're thinking about road trips and places, you know, when you think of the state of Missouri, you wouldn't necessarily think, you know, transgender, you know, amazing place for transgender inclusion. But, you know, there's, you know, the first of its kind, there's a transgender memorial garden in St. Louis. And so, you know, those that are in St. Louis, you know, swing on by. It's spring's coming, so hopefully there'll be some flowers there soon. But, you know, there's these all kinds of places to see. With the book, what I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just doing was focusing on the usual suspects, right? I wanted usual suspects, but then I also wanted unsung heroes. And so, you know, there are some folks that, you know, I would love to have had in the book, but, you know, they were in states that were really competitive, like New York, for example. Tons and tons and tons of people, right? And so it was really difficult being like, oh yes, you've made amazing contributions to the, you know, to the movement and to the country, but you know, there's only so much space. And yes, New York can't take up 100 pages within the book. So same thing with California. You know, if you were in a state like, you know, Wyoming, it would be easier, right? Because, you know, Wyoming was actually one of the more difficult states to be able to find entries for because everything focused back on Matthew Shepard. There wasn't much, unfortunately, in regards to the history outside of that incident and things that have come about because of that, which I wanted to make sure that I highlighted and thanked Dennis and Judy Shepard because, you know, I've had this book idea for a while, and meeting Judy Shepard at National Coming Out Day was the final push for me to finally make this book happen, because it was thinking about Matthew that made me think about.
This was the same NCOD that you spoke at, right?
Yep. Same National Coming Out Day luncheon. Yep. And so I've had the pleasure of meeting her several times since then, and I know she's excited for the book as well.
Yeah. How many people get to say that? Oh, I spoke at the same event as Judy Shepard, right? That's no big deal either, right? So it sounded like you had to make some tough. I mean, so I do it all the time, as you know, as a podcaster, right? Like you're always having to make those editorial cut decisions, right? So I'm assuming, you know, this was probably a new experience for you as a new author. I guess as a lawyer, you do a lot of writing and a lot of like revamping things. But I wanted to ask you about, so you're a first time author. Like, what was this like, you know, experience? Like, I mean, you're approaching the finish line, you're getting there. But I mean, all the way from, I mean, just like putting together the ideas to like all the nuts and bolts of sort of like how the business works and like the publishing and all the stuff. Like I would have no idea. What can you tell people? Because, you know, actually there are probably a lot of people that maybe have an interesting story or have something that they're passionate about that they wanted to write a book about. What would you tell people about that process as a first time writer?
Well, I'd recommend that they, you know, seek the insight and expertise of professionals that are in the industry. You know, I know that you do the podcast, and I know that there's folks that try to do podcasts on their own, and it's a difficult process. It's not easy. And
True story. Yeah.
And it's the same thing with writing a book. You know, my book was different because it was really focused on history and really research intensive, as opposed to, you know, writing a piece of fiction where it's about setting aside the time to be able to write and come up with a creative story. And so I was lucky because I have a really good friend that owns a local small, you know, independent publishing company that focuses on social justice type book and work. So
what? No way.
Yeah. So Wise Ink.
That was lucky, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, let's shout him out again.
Shameless plug for Wise Ink Creative Publishing with Dara Beavis. But you know, just 2 weeks after National Coming Out Day, I made sure I scheduled a lunch with Dara, and I was like, hey, I have this really good book idea. Let me know. Give me your honest opinion. You know, if you think this is a crappy idea, just let me know, and I'll just like, you know, throw it in the trash bin. But no, I met with her, and she's like, this is brilliant. This is amazing. This needs to happen. I want to do this book with you. Let's make it.
Why has no one done this yet?
Why has nobody done this yet? Which is kind of crazy. Yeah. And so, you know, within 2 months, we were on the road in regards to creating the book.
And so, I mean, what all is involved? I mean, just like what? So you have to. Is there like a rough draft, and then I mean, like before you send it, I'm sure that's a big day sending it off to be printed, right? I mean, what are some of like the steps along the way that you kind of learned about in this process?
Well, my book has a bunch of different parts, so it's been quite the assembly line because there's the big research that you have to do in each state, and so that's like and then all the territories and stuff. So there's 54 different chunks of research to do. And so there's the initial research and then paring it down. And then there's the editing in regards to each entry and making sure that it's seamless and it has the same structure as everywhere else. And so that's taken a bit. We have custom illustrations for the book too. So each state has a custom illustration.
And these illustrations, where do these illustrations come from?
So we have an illustrator that my publisher helped us acquire, that's helping us out in regards to doing that. So the custom illustration was a whole nother level because then I'd have to decide out of these entries, who do I want to have in the custom illustration, and then send that off to the illustrator to be able to come up with that idea. Then there's selecting photos because you want to have photos in the book because people like looking at pictures. So then there's selecting photos that are going to be in the book and then selecting quotes that are going to be in the book. So there's like layers and layers and layers and layers and lots of different people and involved and stuff. And then once you get it all done, then you have to, make sure that you have it proofread and that, you don't have a bunch of typos, and you have to make sure that all of your research is cited. So that's a whole nother thing. I know about citing cases from my legal briefs, but this is a different.
It's kind of up your alley. I mean, you're used to researching and going over information and compiling information and stuff, right?
True. But then, and so there's just a bunch of different layers, and I have to write, the foreword in the book, which talks about the story in regards to how I came up with the book idea, because people are always going to want to know that, why should I buy this book? Why was this book created? And it's an important story to know, the meaning and the message behind why this book was created. So a bunch of, and then in the end, we'll have all the thank yous for the folks that supported the Kickstarter campaign and, funders that helped me in the very beginning because, each level costs more money in regards to book development.
Can people still support the campaign?
Yep. You can, there's two ways that people can support the campaign. They can pre-order the book. So that's on gay50states.com. So gay50states.com is our website. So that's where individuals can go in and pre-order the book. You can pre-order a regular copy or a signed copy. But then as well, if there are any companies or individuals that are looking at sponsoring a state, so we have a state sponsorship, like a Gold Rush type inspired situation where people can, based on the state size, they can purchase, sponsor the state, which would mean that a certain number of books would be published in their name, and then those books would be donated to LGBT nonprofits and organizations throughout the state. And so, there's only one sponsorship available for each state. So just throwing that out there, it's the scarcity aspect of it, just like Gold Rush. So if there's any individuals out there that are interested, the lowest sponsorship amount is $2,500, and that's for 75 books. And it goes all the way up to $10,000, which is 300 books. So the bigger states are going to be the 300 book range, and then the smaller states are going to be the 75 book range.
So I thought podcasting was hard. This sounds like a lot of work. I don't think I'll be writing a book anytime soon, man. So what else? So as we're wrapping up here, what else would you like people to know about the book, the project in general, maybe what you've learned from the process? I mean, every artist sort of like has a process that they go through and they come out on the other side a little bit differently. At least what else would you like people to know as we're wrapping up here about the project or anything else you've been involved in like this year?
Yeah, I'm excited for the book. I'm excited for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. World Pride is coming here to the United States. So the other states that have their prides the cities that have their prides at the same time have moved those dates so that it's not competing against this momentous occasion. Because even though this book is, focused on the LGBT, struggle and story here in the United States, we're a beacon of hope for other countries as well. There's a lot more privileges and rights that we have here than there are in many other countries. And so, some of the other nations, their pride is called Stonewall, right? And so, I'm excited that Stonewall's coming and the book is coming out just in time for that. And so, I encourage folks to buy the book for somebody else, buy it for their local library or their school. So this is a resource for, those kids who may still think that they're the only one out there and they're the only one like them, and to hopefully provide hope for those kids so that they know that it does get better. It's easier for us as adults to look back and say, well, yeah, it's good now because I can survive for myself. But then when you have a kid that's being bullied because of who they are, and now with social media, that happens 24/7. Whereas before, once you left school, you didn't necessarily have to deal with it. I was just at an event earlier where they were saying that their kid doesn't have an iPhone, they have an iPod. But when they get home, there's like 200 messages that they have from group chats and stuff with their friends. And this kid's 10 years old. So it's crazy thinking about that. So, we need to be there and we need to support each other and get involved in your local organizations and your local fights. So, for example, with these school initiatives in regards to gender inclusion policies, I mean, these issues and struggles are likely happening across the country at local school boards. So, showing up and being that voice makes a difference.
And just from knowing you and just from talking to you today and kind of knowing about all the things that you're involved in, to me, it seems like there's a constant theme across, pretty much everything you do. And it's kind of what you referred to towards the beginning of our episode here, is that it seems like you're of the very strong opinion that there is definitely room for improvement when it comes to, all of the communities that make up, all of the marginalized communities that, we're all out there fighting for.